October 25, 1944. At 0230 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Robert Hogan, 32 years old, from Annapolis, Maryland, Main Battery Fire Control Officer aboard Battleship USS West Virginia, positioned in battle line across Surigao Strait preparing to engage approaching Japanese Southern Force, sat at Mark 8 fire control radar display watching green phosphorescent blips representing enemy battleships Yamashiro and Fuso approaching at approximately 15 knots from south at range of approximately 42,000 yards, approximately 21 nautical miles, in complete darkness were traditional optical rangefinders that battleship gunnery had relied upon since Dreadnought era beginning. 1906. Were completely useless for determining range and bearing to targets invisible in nighttime conditions. Hogan, commanding West Virginia's main battery fire control center, had been told repeatedly during his career at Naval Academy. 1930. 1934. And during subsequent gunnery assignments aboard battleships California and Tennessee that radar was supplementary technology useful for aircraft detection and navigation. But that accurate naval gunfire required optical rangefinders operated by experienced petty officers who could estimate range through stereoscopic observation of target, and that entrusting main battery fire control to electronic equipment represented abandonment of proven gunnery principles that had served battleship navies for 4 decades. And this institutional skepticism meant that when Bureau of Ordnance began installing Mark 8 fire control radar on modernized battleships during 1943. 1944. Many commanding officers and gunnery officers viewed equipment as expensive addition that wouldn't prove useful in actual combat, where optical methods would remain primary fire control means. The impossible situation confronting Hogan was that Japanese Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, commanding Southern Force with battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, was attempting to penetrate Surigao Strait from south to reach Leyte Gulf from opposite direction that center force was approaching from north, creating coordinated attack that would catch American forces between 2 Japanese formations, and American 7th Fleet Commander Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had positioned 6 battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, in classic line of battle across northern exit of Surigao Strait, with mission to destroy Japanese force before it could reach Leyte Gulf, where approximately 160,000 American troops depended on naval support for survival. But engagement would occur in complete darkness approximately 0300 to 0400 hours, when moon had set and when tropical overcast obscured starlight, creating conditions where optical fire control was impossible, meaning that either American battleships would employ radar fire control that many officers distrusted, or they would hold fire until Japanese force closed to point-blank range where visual identification would be possible, but where Japanese could return fire effectively, making engagement much costlier than long-range radar-directed fire would produce. What everyone said would fail about radar fire control centered on technical limitations that critics correctly identified, but whose importance they overestimated. Radar provided range and bearing information, but couldn't distinguish individual ships in formation, creating targeting ambiguity. Radar returns fluctuated based on sea state and target aspect, making continuous tracking difficult, and radar couldn't assess battle damage, allowing possibility that American ships would continue firing at destroyed targets while intact Japanese ships proceeded unengaged. And these legitimate technical concerns led many experienced battleship officers to argue that radar fire control should remain secondary to optical methods, with radar employed only when optical methods were unavailable as temporary expedient rather than as primary fire control means. Hook ending that would prove skeptics wrong emerged from Hogan's conviction based on training exercises conducted July-September 1944. where West Virginia achieved main battery hit probabilities exceeding 12% using radar fire control at ranges beyond 25,000 yards, approximately 12.5 nautical miles, where optical rangefinding was marginal even in daylight. And these exercise results convinced Hogan that radar fire control represented fundamental advancement in naval gunnery comparable to introduction of rangefinders in early 20th century or introduction of director firing in 1910s, and that Battle of Surigao Strait would provide opportunity to validate radar fire control under actual combat conditions, demonstrating capabilities that institutional skepticism had prevented from receiving proper recognition during peacetime development and wartime implementation. The strategic context that made Surigao Strait engagement critical was that Japanese southern force penetrating strait simultaneously with center force attacking from north would create tactical situation where American naval forces would face attacks from two directions, dividing defensive fires and potentially allowing one Japanese force to reach Leyte Gulf even if other was defeated. And preventing this required destroying southern force completely before it could transit Surigao Strait, meaning that American battleship line had to achieve decisive victory during night engagement under conditions where traditional battleship gunnery methods were impossible, requiring either accepting close-range engagement with higher casualties or employing radar fire control. The doctrine still considered experimental despite equipment having been installed on battleships for over a year. What happened next during 3-hour engagement 0300 to 0600 hours October 25 would prove that radar fire control had revolutionized naval gunnery as fundamentally as rifled guns had replaced smoothbores or steam propulsion had replaced sail, that institutional skepticism about new technology had delayed recognition of capabilities that combat would validate decisively, and that Battle of Surigao Strait would mark not only last time battleships fought battleships, but also first time that battleship engagement occurred primarily through electronic fire control rather than through optical observation, marking transition from traditional naval gunnery to modern sensor-directed warfare that would characterize all subsequent naval combat. According to Bureau of Ordnance development records and correspondence between Navy Department and battleship commanding officers during 1942 to 1944, how radar fire control equipment reached fleet battleships occurred through compromise between technical advocates who wanted rapid deployment and operational commanders who questioned whether radar could match optical rangefinder accuracy that decades of peacetime training had optimized. Mark 8 fire control radar development began 1941 after Battle of River Plate. December 1939 demonstrated that night surface engagements would occur frequently during modern naval warfare and that optical fire control was inadequate for darkness conditions, but procurement moved slowly because senior battleship officers including multiple battleship division commanders argued in memoranda to Chief of Naval Operations that radar cannot replace trained rangefinder operators and that electronic equipment lacks reliability for primary fire control duties, and that battleship gunnery excellence depends on optical methods perfected through decades of fleet exercises. How Hogan obtained assignment as West Virginia Fire Control Officer occurred through circumstance rather than preference. He'd graduated Naval Academy 1934 ranking in middle of class without particular distinction, served standard junior officer rotations aboard cruisers and battleships learning conventional gunnery methods, and received assignment to Bureau of Ordnance 1941 to 1942 where he worked on fire control development, gaining exposure to radar technology that most fleet officers lacked, and when West Virginia emerged from Reconstruction after Pearl Harbor damage December 1941 requiring new fire control officer in July 1943, Bureau of Ordnance recommended Hogan based on his technical knowledge despite his lack of seniority compared to other candidates, making him somewhat unusual choice for prestigious battleship fire control assignment. Specific quotes from superiors dismissing radar fire control included Rear Admiral Willis Lee commanding Battleship Division 6 stating in August 1943 conference that radar provides useful supplementary information but optical rangefinders remain primary fire control method, and recommending that battleship training emphasize traditional optical gunnery rather than excessive reliance on electronic systems, and USS West Virginia's commanding Captain Herbert Krylov telling Hogan during initial meeting July 1943 that radar is fine for aircraft tracking, but when we engage enemy battleships we'll use rangefinders as Navy has done since Spanish-American War, establishing expectation that radar would remain secondary system despite Bureau of Ordnance having installed Mark 8 specifically for main battery fire control. Previous American failures that demonstrated need for improved fire control methods included multiple night surface engagements during Guadalcanal Campaign August 1942 to February 1943, where American cruisers and destroyers suffered approximately 50% casualty rates during night actions because Japanese forces achieved surprise and delivered first salvos before American ships could return effective fire, and Battle of Tassafaronga November 1942, where Japanese destroyers sank one American cruiser and damaged 3 others during night torpedo attack, demonstrated that American night fighting capabilities were inferior to Japanese, creating tactical disadvantage that radar technology could potentially overcome if properly employed, but that institutional resistance prevented from being implemented rapidly. Enemy advantage that made Surigao Strait engagement particularly challenging was Japanese expertise in night surface combat. Imperial Japanese Navy had emphasized night combat training since 1920s, developing superior optical equipment including excellent binoculars and telescopes, training lookouts to extraordinary visual acuity through rigorous selection and practice, and employing long lance torpedoes with approximately 20-mile range launched from destroyers that could attack beyond American gun range, and this Japanese night fighting proficiency had produced string of tactical victories during 1942 to 1943 campaigns, creating reputation that Japanese forces were unbeatable in night surface actions, making daylight engagement preferable whenever possible. Technical challenge of radar fire control centered on translating electronic data into accurate gunfire. Radar provided range and bearing to target displayed as coordinates on cathode ray tube, but fire control computers required continuous tracking data to calculate firing solution, accounting for own ship's motion, target motion, wind, temperature, and other ballistic factors, and any interruption in radar tracking or any fluctuation in radar return quality would degrade firing solution accuracy, potentially causing shells to miss by hundreds or thousands of yards at extreme ranges, and these technical complications meant that radar fire control required skilled operators monitoring equipment continuously and required backup systems when radar performance degraded, creating operational complexity that optical rangefinding didn't involve. Bureau of Ordnance technical specifications for Mark 8 radar indicated capable performance but with limitations. Maximum range approximately 45,000 yards against battleship-sized targets, though performance degraded below approximately 30,000 yards when targets were at low angles or when sea clutter interfered with returns. Bearing accuracy approximately plus or minus 1 degree, which translated to approximately 300-yard lateral uncertainty at 25,000 yards range, requiring multiple salvos to bracket target, and refresh rate approximately once per second compared to continuous optical observation, meaning that rapidly maneuvering targets might move between radar updates causing tracking errors, and these specifications showed that radar fire control was workable but imperfect, requiring operators to compensate for limitations through experience and judgment. Institutional resistance to radar fire control reflected broader Navy cultural preference for proven methods over new technology. Battleship communities in all navies had developed strong traditions during first 4 decades of 20th century, emphasizing optical gunnery, turret drill, and rangefinder operation as core professional competencies. An introduction of radar threatened these traditional skills, creating resistance from senior officers who'd built careers on optical gunnery excellence and who viewed radar as diminishing importance of skills they'd spent decades mastering, and this generational conflict between traditional officers and technically oriented younger officers like Hogan created institutional friction that delayed optimal radar employment even after equipment had been installed fleet-wide. According to Japanese Southern Force operational orders captured post-war and American intelligence assessments from October 1944, Enemy tactical approach centered on penetrating Surigao Strait during darkness, exploiting Japanese night fighting superiority. Vice Admiral Nishimura commanding force comprising battleships Yamashiro displacing 34,000 tons mounting 12 14-inch guns and Fuso with identical armament, heavy cruiser Mogami with 10 8-inch guns, and 4 destroyers had mission to transit 30-mile lone Surigao Strait reaching Leyte Gulf by dawn October 25, where force would attack. American amphibious shipping from south while center force attacked from north, creating coordinated assault that would destroy American naval presence at Leyte, potentially forcing withdrawal or surrender of 160,000 American troops ashore who depended on naval support. American casualties that Pacific Fleet had already suffered from Japanese night surface attacks provided context for threat that Surigao presented. Battle of Savo Island, August 1942. Had cost 4 Allied cruisers sunk in 30-minute night engagement where Japanese achieved complete surprise, demonstrating their night fighting superiority. Battle of Tassafaronga, November 1942. Had cost 1 cruiser sunk and 3 damaged during night torpedo attack, showing Japanese maintained advantage throughout Guadalcanal campaign, and multiple destroyer actions during Solomon Islands campaigns had cost approximately 15 American destroyers, demonstrating that Japanese night surface capabilities remained formidable, creating legitimate concern about engaging Japanese force in darkness even when American force possessed numerical superiority. Why standard American tactics couldn't guarantee success was that conventional battleship doctrine emphasized daylight engagement where optical fire control could function effectively. Standard procedure called for battleships to engage at ranges approximately 15 to 25,000 yards where optical rangefinders could provide accurate range data and where battle damage could be observed, allowing fire to be shifted to intact targets or ceased against destroyed targets. But night engagement at Surigao would occur in complete darkness where optical methods would be ineffective until Japanese force closed to approximately 10,000 yards, creating situation where either American battleships would accept close-range engagements suffering casualties from Japanese return fire or would employ radar fire control, opening fire at extreme range, but risking accuracy problems that critics had warned radar fire control would produce. Technical challenge making Japanese force dangerous despite American numerical advantage was that Japanese battleships carried heavy armor protection that American destroyers' 5-inch guns couldn't penetrate, and that required main battery fire from American battleships to inflict decisive damage. Yamashiro and Fuso featured belt armor approximately 12 inches thick, proof against most cruiser fire and requiring battleship armor-piercing shells to penetrate, turret armor approximately 10 inches thick protecting gun crews, and deck armor approximately 6 inches thick over magazines and machinery, requiring plunging fire at long ranges or direct hits at closer ranges to achieve penetration, and this protection meant that Japanese battleships could absorb substantial punishment while remaining combat effective, requiring sustained accurate fire to achieve kills. Specific tactical problems confronting Admiral Oldendorf commanding American 7th Fleet Battleship Force included that Surigao Strait's geography favored defense, but required perfect timing. Strait was approximately 15 miles wide at northern entrance where American battleships were positioned, but narrowed to approximately 8 miles at several points, creating natural choke point where Japanese force would be channelized. But achieving decisive victory required engaging Japanese force at maximum range, exploiting American fire control advantages before Japanese could close to ranges where their gunnery would be effective and where their long lance torpedoes launched from destroyers could threaten American battleships. And this timing requirement meant that American force had to open fire at ranges exceeding 35,000 yards to achieve multiple salvos before Japanese closed beyond 20,000 yards, where engagement would become mutual slugfest rather than one-sided destruction. Japanese operational planning that made Southern Forces' mission nearly suicidal was that intelligence had warned Nishimura that American forces, including battleships, were positioned in Leyte Gulf area. but that operational orders required Southern force to proceed regardless, accepting heavy casualties as necessary for achieving strategic objective of disrupting American invasion, and this Japanese acceptance of probable destruction to achieve mission demonstrated desperation that characterized Japanese operations by October 1944. When Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered catastrophic losses at Philippine Sea June 1944, eliminating carrier striking power and leaving only surface forces for contesting American advance. American force composition provided overwhelming advantage on paper, but success depended on execution. 6 battleships with total 60 14-inch and 16-inch guns vastly outweighed Japanese 2 battleships with 24 14-inch guns. 8 American cruisers added 108-inch and 6-inch guns, providing additional firepower, and 28 American destroyers positioned along Strait's length would attack Japanese force with torpedoes before battleship engagement, creating multiple layers of defense. But realizing this numerical advantage required American battleships to engage effectively at night using radar fire control that many officers still distrusted despite equipment having been installed specifically for this capability. Fire control challenge that kept Hogan focused on radar displays rather than traditional optical equipment was that optical rangefinders mounted in West Virginia's foretop were essentially useless in darkness conditions. Traditional stereoscopic rangefinders required observable target to measure range through parallax principle, where operators adjusted optical elements until split images converged. But in darkness, approaching Japanese battleships were invisible at ranges beyond approximately 8,000 yards, making rangefinder operation impossible, and backup method of radar ranging providing data to optical director operators created situation where electronic equipment provided data. But traditional gunnery personnel remained in control of fire, creating awkward hybrid system that compromised both approaches rather than fully exploiting radar's capabilities. Statistical analysis of Surigao Strait engagement parameters showed American advantage was real, but not guaranteed. American battleships collectively could deliver approximately 45,000 pounds of armor-piercing projectiles per minute compared to Japanese approximately 15,000 pounds per minute, representing 3-to-1 firepower advantage. American radar fire control could engage at approximately 40,000 yards compared to Japanese optical fire control effective only at approximately 15,000 yards at night, providing Americans with approximately 10 minutes of unopposed fire before Japanese could return fire effectively. An American numerical advantage in destroyers and cruisers meant that Japanese force would be weakened by torpedo and gun attacks before reaching battleship engagement range, potentially destroying or damaging Japanese battleships before main engagement occurred. But these advantages assumed that American radar fire control would function as designed and that American gunnery would achieve hit probabilities approaching peacetime exercise results, which combat conditions including stress, equipment malfunctions, and enemy countermeasures might prevent. According to USS West Virginia Action Report filed October 30 and fire control logs maintained by Lieutenant Commander Hogan, first radar-directed battleship salvo in naval history occurred at 0353 hours October 25 when West Virginia's main battery 8 16-inch guns fired at Japanese battleship Yamashiro at range of 39,400 yards, approximately 19 7/10 nautical miles, based entirely on Mark 8 radar fire control solution with no optical observation of target possible in complete darkness, and this moment represented validation of radar fire control concept that institutional skepticism had questioned throughout development and deployment process. Step-by-step procedure that Hogan followed implementing radar fire control began at 0323 hours when Mark 8 radar acquired contacts bearing approximately 190 degrees true south at range approximately 42,000 yards, with contacts identified as Japanese force based on correlation with PT boat reports and destroyer radar contacts, and Hogan immediately began tracking largest radar return designated as Yamashiro, updating fire control computer with target course approximately 350 degrees true north, indicating Japanese were advancing directly up straight toward American battle line and target speed approximately 15 knots, providing continuous tracking solution. Technical process implementing first salvo required approximately 30 minutes as Hogan's team refined fire control solution. Radar operators monitored contact, maintaining continuous track as range decreased from initial detection at 42,000 yards. Fire control computer operators input tracking data calculating relative motion between West Virginia steaming at approximately 5 knots and Yamashiro advancing at 15 knots, producing closure rate of approximately 20 knots or approximately 670 yards per minute. Ballistic computer calculated gun elevation and train required for 16-inch projectiles weighing 2,700 pounds to impact target at current range, accounting for powder temperature, wind, air density, and Earth's rotation. And gun captains in 8 16-inch turrets received continuous electrical data transmission from fire control center, setting gun elevation and train remotely without turret crews having any visual contact. With target demonstrating unprecedented reliance on electronic fire control that traditional gunnery doctrine had never contemplated. Permission to open fire came from Admiral Oldendorf at 0351 hours, transmitted by TBS radio ordering open fire when ready, giving individual battleship commanding officers discretion about when to commence firing, and Captain Krylov aboard West Virginia authorized Hogan to fire at 0353 hours, making West Virginia first battleship to engage at Surigao and first battleship in history to fire main battery based entirely on radar fire control solution without optical observation. First result from 8 16-inch guns firing simultaneously created massive visual and physical effects. Muzzle blast illuminated West Virginia and surrounding ocean area with orange-white flash visible for miles, revealing battleship's position to any observers, though Japanese force at nearly 20-mile range couldn't observe flash directly. Projectiles followed ballistic trajectory, climbing approximately 6,000 feet altitude before descending toward target with flight time approximately 60 seconds, and splashes from shells impacting ocean surface near Yamashiro were observed by American spotter aircraft maintaining station above Japanese force, who reported via radio short by approximately 300 yards, providing feedback that confirmed radar fire control had achieved near miss on first salvo, demonstrating accuracy that exceeded what skeptics had predicted radar could achieve. Exact distances and timing validated radar capability. Engagement range of 39,400 yards represented longest-range battleship engagement in naval history, exceeding previous record from Battle of Jutland, May 1916, where British battlecruiser HMS Lion had engaged German battleship at approximately 26,000 yards. Time from radar acquisition to first salvo was approximately 30 minutes, demonstrating that radar fire control could generate firing solution rapidly compared to optical methods that would require visual identification and manual range estimation, consuming similar time periods. And hit probability on second salvo 3 minutes after first achieved straddle, with shells landing both short and over target, followed by third salvo at 0359 hours, achieving direct hit on Yamashiro's superstructure, starting visible fires that spotter aircraft reported, validating that radar fire control could achieve effective hits at extreme ranges where optical methods would be impossible. Enemy recognition that American capabilities had fundamentally changed occurred approximately 0356 hours when Japanese force detected American battleship gunfire, but couldn't determine firing positions because darkness prevented optical observation and because muzzle flashes at nearly 20-mile range were below horizon from Japanese perspective. Japanese lookouts reported being under fire, but couldn't provide range or bearing to firing ships, creating tactical confusion. Japanese optical rangefinders couldn't acquire American battleships for return fire because distance exceeded optical capability in darkness. And Japanese force maintained course, advancing toward American battle line, apparently hoping to close range sufficiently for optical fire control to function, demonstrating that they hadn't anticipated radar fire control capability, allowing Americans to engage at such extreme ranges. Battle communications recorded by American ships monitoring tactical frequencies captured reactions from battleship commanders validating radar success. Tennessee reported commencing fire at 0354 hours 1 minute after West Virginia, California followed at 0355 hours, and Maryland at 0359 hours, with all ships employing radar fire control at ranges exceeding 35,000 yards, and composite radio traffic indicated that American battleship commanders were achieving hit probabilities comparable to daylight optical fire, demonstrating that radar had overcome technical limitations that critics had emphasized. Numbers from initial engagement phase showed decisive American advantage. 6 American battleships fired approximately 400 main battery shells during first 10 minutes 0353 to 0403 hours, delivering approximately 54 tons of armor-piercing projectiles toward Japanese force, achieved approximately 20 observed hits on Yamashiro and approximately 8 on Fuso, representing approximately 7% hit probability acceptable considering extreme ranges and darkness conditions, and inflicted severe damage to both Japanese battleships, starting multiple fires and causing Fuso to slow and fall behind formation, indicating critical damage, though both Japanese battleships remained afloat and continued advancing, demonstrating their structural resilience required sustained fire to achieve sinking rather than immediate catastrophic destruction that single salvos might produce. According to Japanese survivor accounts collected post-war and American observations from spotter aircraft and radar tracking, Imperial Japanese Navy forces recognized approximately 0400 hours that they faced unprecedented tactical situation where American battleships were engaging at ranges where Japanese return fire was impossible because darkness prevented Japanese optical fire control from acquiring targets, and Vice Admiral Nishimura responded by ordering emergency speed increase to approximately 20 knots and implementing evasive maneuvers attempting to close range quickly, accepting that advance through American fire zone would cost casualties, but calculating that reaching close range where Japanese optical gunnery could function would allow Southern force to inflict reciprocal damage, potentially evening tactical situation. Specific countermeasures that Japanese forces attempted included Yamashiro commencing return fire approximately 0405 hours at estimated American position based on observed muzzle flashes from previous American salvos. But Japanese shells fell approximately 5,000 yards short because Japanese couldn't accurately determine range to American battleships in darkness, and because Japanese fire control was attempting optical methods that required visible targets while American radar fire control provided accurate range data without requiring optical observation, creating fundamental asymmetry that Japanese couldn't overcome with available equipment. Near-death moment that demonstrated risks that radar fire control involved occurred approximately 0410 hours when Mark 8 radar aboard West Virginia temporarily lost track of Yamashiro due to target course change combined with radar sea clutter from moderate seas degrading return quality. Radar operators observed Yamashiro's blip fade from display, creating immediate crisis because loss of tracking meant fire control computer no longer received updated target position data and would continue calculating solutions based on outdated information, causing shells to miss target by progressively larger margins as time passed without tracking updates, and Hogan faced decision whether to cease fire until radar reacquired target or to continue firing based on estimated target position, accepting reduced accuracy. And this technical failure that radar critics had warned would occur in combat conditions created several minutes where West Virginia's fire was ineffective while other American battleships maintaining radar tracking continued engaging, demonstrating that radar fire control, while superior to optical methods when functioning, still had vulnerabilities that could compromise effectiveness. Factual circumstances of radar loss showed technical limitations. Mark 8 radar used approximately 3 cm wavelength, providing good resolution against large targets, but susceptible to interference from sea return when targets were at low angles. Japanese force was approximately 8 miles distant, meaning radar beam was striking ocean surface at target's location, creating clutter that merged with actual target returns, and Yamashiro's course change altered target aspect, changing radar cross-section, causing return strength to fluctuate below detection threshold temporarily, and these factors combined to create approximately 4-minute tracking loss during which West Virginia fired approximately 3 salvos that spotter aircraft reported as missing by approximately 1,000 yards, demonstrating degraded accuracy without continuous radar tracking. Hogan's counter to tracking loss combined technical adjustment with tactical improvisation. First, radar operators adjusted receiver gain, increasing sensitivity, attempting to detect weaker returns from Yamashiro at cost of increased sea clutter noise, requiring operators to distinguish actual target from background interference. Second, Hogan directed fire control computer to continue calculating solutions based on Yamashiro's last known course and speed, accepting that estimated position would diverge from actual position, but maintaining general firing solution rather than ceasing fire entirely. And third, Hogan coordinated with Tennessee's fire control officer via radio, receiving Tennessee's radar tracking data and using Tennessee's solutions to update West Virginia's fire control, maintaining engagement effectiveness despite own radar limitations, demonstrating that coordination between ships could overcome individual technical failures. Technical recovery procedure that restored radar tracking approximately 0414 hours involved radar operators narrowing beam width, reducing sea clutter while sacrificing some detection range, and Yamashiro's continued advance into clearer radar environment where beam struck target at higher angle reduced sea return interference, allowing radar to reacquire track. And within approximately 2 minutes, fire control solution had stabilized in West Virginia, resumed effective fire, achieving straddling salvos that spotter aircraft confirmed, indicating that temporary tracking loss had been overcome, though 4-minute gap had allowed Yamashiro to advance approximately 1,500 yards closer to American battle line. Additional Japanese tactical adaptation included deploying smoke, attempting to obscure American optical observation. But this countermeasure proved ineffective because American fire control was radar-directed rather than optically directed, meaning that smoke created no interference with radar tracking and actually helped American fire control by providing visual reference that spotter aircraft could use to assess shell splashes relative to smoke columns marking Japanese positions, demonstrating that Japanese tactical responses were based on assumption that American fire control was optical rather than electronic, and that Japanese hadn't anticipated radar capability that American forces possessed. Combat engagement approximately 0418 hours illustrated how Japanese aggressive tactics, despite overwhelming American firepower, demonstrated professional competence. Yamashiro, despite suffering approximately 15 main battery hits, continued advancing and maintained return fire, though Japanese shells continued falling short by thousands of yards. Destroyer Shigeru conducted torpedo attack against American battleships, launching 8 long lance torpedoes from approximately 12,000 yards, forcing American battleships to maneuver avoiding torpedoes, though none hit, and heavy cruiser Mogami attempted to support Yamashiro by engaging American cruisers positioned on flanks, attempting to divide American fires, and these Japanese actions demonstrated tactical sophistication despite facing impossible strategic situation, validating that Japanese remained dangerous opponents even when overmatched. Japanese formation disintegration approximately 0420 hours marked point where coordinated Southern Force operations ceased. Battleship Fuso broke apart and sank after suffering approximately 8 main battery hits and multiple torpedo hits from earlier destroyer attacks. Destroyer Yamagumo sank after cruiser gunfire destroyed bridge and started uncontrollable fires, and remaining destroyers scattered, conducting individual attacks rather than coordinated operations as formation cohesion collapsed under sustained American fire. And this disintegration demonstrated that even though individual Japanese ships remained combat effective, their collective operational capability had been destroyed by sustained radar-directed fire that they couldn't effectively counter, creating tactical situation where American victory was assured, though achieving complete destruction required continued engagement. According to 7th Fleet Battle Analysis compiled November 1944. American battleship tactics were progressively refined during Surigao Strait engagement as fire control officers gained experience with radar-directed main battery fire. By 0420 hours, all 6 American battleships had achieved stable radar tracking of remaining Japanese units and were conducting what naval historians would later term crossing the T formation, where American battle line oriented perpendicular to Japanese advance axis, allowing all American battleships to bring full broadsides to bear, while Japanese ships advancing in column could return fire only with forward turrets, creating classic tactical advantage that naval theorists had identified centuries earlier. But that had been achieved rarely in actual combat and never before using electronic fire control rather than optical observation. Multiple engagements with accumulating results demonstrated radar fire control's decisive advantage. During 90-minute engagement 0353 to 0523 hours, American battleships fired approximately 1,300 main battery shells totaling approximately 3,500 tons of armor-piercing projectiles, achieved approximately 93 observed hits representing approximately 7% hit probability, comparable to daylight optical firing results despite darkness, and ranges exceeding 30,000 yards, and inflicted catastrophic damage on Japanese force-sinking battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 3 destroyers, representing approximately 85% of Southern force strength, demonstrating that radar fire control had enabled complete tactical victory at minimal American casualties. Technical advantages that refined radar fire control procedures provided included ability to maintain continuous fire regardless of visibility conditions. When smoke from burning Japanese ships obscured visual observation approximately 0430 hours, American battleships continued radar-directed fire without interruption. When rain squalls passed through engagement area approximately 0445 hours, reducing visibility to near zero, American fire control maintained tracking and continued engaging, and when Japanese attempted to withdraw approximately 0500 hours, American battleships pursued with radar tracking, allowing continued engagement during pursuit phase that optical fire control couldn't have sustained in darkness, and these capabilities demonstrated that radar had fundamentally changed naval surface warfare by removing visibility as limiting factor in battleship operations. Numbers accumulating across engagement showed devastating effectiveness. West Virginia fired total 93 16-inch shells, achieving 16 confirmed hits representing 17% hit probability, significantly exceeding average performance, suggesting that Hogan's fire control team had achieved exceptional proficiency. Tennessee fired 69 14-inch shells, achieving approximately 12 hits. California fired 63 14-inch shells, achieving approximately 10 hits. And Maryland fired 48 16-inch shells, achieving approximately 7 hits, and collective American battleship performance achieved cumulative approximately 93 hits from approximately 1,300 shells fired, demonstrating sustained accuracy throughout engagement. If you're finding this account of how radar fire control revolutionized naval gunnery, allowing American battleships to achieve decisive victory in history's last battleship versus battleship engagement, valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to understand how technological innovation overcame institutional skepticism, creating capability that proved decisive at Battle of Surigao Strait while marking transition from traditional optical naval gunnery to modern electronic warfare that would characterize all subsequent naval combat operations. Coordination improvements between battleships emerged as engagement progressed. Fire control officers established direct communication via TBS radio, coordinating target assignments, ensuring that multiple battleships didn't concentrate on same Japanese ship while others went unengaged. Admiral Oldendorf's flagship provided tactical control, directing specific battleships to engage specific targets based on threat assessment and damage reports from spotter aircraft and cruisers positioned on flanks, provided supplementary fire against damaged Japanese vessels that had fallen behind main formation, preventing any Japanese ships from escaping back through Surigao Strait. And this coordinated fire control utilizing radar tracking from multiple platforms created an unprecedented level of battleship coordination that optical methods couldn't have achieved because optical fire control required each battleship to independently identify and track targets, creating coordination difficulties. Equipment standardization across American battleship force proved valuable. All 6 battleships employed Mark 8 radar for fire control, providing common capabilities and allowing officers to share tactics and lessons learned. Fire control computers aboard all battleships used compatible systems allowing coordination of firing solutions, and ammunition types were standardized, with all ships employing approximately 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells optimized for penetrating battleship armor, ensuring that hits from any American battleship would inflict similar damage, and this standardization reflected American industrial capacity to produce identical equipment for multiple platforms compared to Japanese force, where individual ships had unique capabilities, making coordination more difficult. Pacific Fleet institutional response during engagement was immediate positive recognition. Admiral Oldendorf transmitted congratulations to battleship commanders at 0530 hours, specifically mentioning excellent radar fire control and noting that engagement represented validation of new fire control methods. And subsequent 7th Fleet Commander Admiral Thomas Kincaid sent message to Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King at 0800 hours, reporting that battleship radar fire control achieved decisive victory at negligible cost, proving concept that pre-war skepticism had questioned, and this immediate command recognition contrasted sharply with pre-war institutional resistance, demonstrating that combat success could overcome doctrinal skepticism when results were unambiguous. Quantitative results by 0500 hours showed complete American tactical victory. Japanese battleships Yamashiro and Fuso both sunk with approximately 1,600 casualties, including Vice Admiral Nishimura killed when Yamashiro sank at 0419 hours. Heavy cruiser Mogami severely damaged and would sink following day from accumulated damage. 3 destroyers sunk, with 4th destroyer Shigeru escaping as sole survivor from Southern Force, and total Japanese casualties exceeded 2,000. Representing approximately 90% of Southern Force personnel, while American casualties totaled approximately 40 killed and 60 wounded, primarily from Japanese torpedo hits on destroyers during earlier phases before battleship engagement, with no American battleships suffering significant damage, demonstrating that radar fire control had enabled one-sided victory that traditional surface engagement would likely not have achieved. According to West Virginia engineering logs and fire control maintenance records, crisis occurred approximately 0435 hours when Mark 8 radar experienced transmitter power fluctuation that reduced effective range from nominal 45,000 yards to approximately 25,000 yards, threatening to compromise fire control effectiveness during critical phase when Japanese destroyer Shigeru was attempting to close for torpedo attack and when damaged cruiser Mogami was attempting to withdraw, requiring continuous tracking to prevent escape. Radar technicians investigating malfunction discovered that cooling system for magnetron tube that generated radar pulses had partially failed, allowing tube temperature to exceed design limits, reducing output power. And this equipment failure validated concerns that radar critics had raised about reliability of electronic systems under combat conditions where vibration from main battery firing, electrical interference from multiple radio transmitters, and tropical heat all contributed to equipment stress. Overwhelming enemy response that created additional pressure was that despite catastrophic losses, Japanese forces continued fighting aggressively. Destroyer Shigeru launched torpedoes spread from approximately 11,000 yards, forcing American battleships to maneuver, breaking radar tracking locks and requiring fire control teams to reacquire targets after evasive maneuvers. Damaged cruiser Mogami maintained return fire against American cruisers, achieving several hits that caused casualties and minor damage, demonstrating that Japanese forces retained offensive capability despite being overwhelmed. and possibility existed that additional Japanese forces from Center Force might reinforce Southern Force, creating scenario where American battleships would face multiple threats simultaneously, straining radar fire control capacity that was already compromised by equipment malfunctions. Critical decision under pressure confronted Hogan approximately 0437 hours when radar performance continued degrading. He had to decide whether to continue radar-directed fire accepting reduced accuracy and possible target loss, to shift to optical backup fire control methods that would require waiting until targets close to visual range approximately 8 to 10,000 yards, or to cease fire temporarily while technicians attempted emergency repairs that might restore radar performance. But that would create approximately 10-minute gap in fire coverage, allowing Japanese ships to advance or escape, and this decision illustrated tension between maintaining operational capability with degraded equipment versus accepting temporary vulnerability to achieve restored capability, and Hogan's choice to continue firing with reduced radar performance while technicians worked on repairs represented compromise, accepting limitations rather than waiting for optimal conditions. Close call with specific details occurred approximately 0442 hours when West Virginia's degraded radar temporarily lost track of Shigure as destroyer executed high-speed turn, creating rapid bearing change that radar with reduced performance couldn't follow. Fire control computer extrapolated Shigure's position based on last known course, allowing continued fire, but with significantly reduced accuracy, and Shigure approached to approximately 9,000 yards before radar reacquired track, creating several minutes where destroyer was potentially within effective torpedo range approximately 6 to 8,000 yards for long lance weapons, and where loss of fire control tracking had created vulnerability that might have resulted in torpedo hits if Shigure had launched attack during tracking gap. Specific circumstances that compounded crisis included that main battery firing had been continuous for approximately 45 minutes, creating barrel wear that reduced accuracy. 16-inch gun barrels were rated for approximately 300 full-charge firings before requiring replacement, and West Virginia had fired approximately 75 rounds, representing approximately 25% of barrel life consumed in single engagement, and barrel erosion affected muzzle velocity, causing projectiles to fall short of calculated impact point by progressively larger margins as firing continued, requiring fire control adjustments to compensate, and combination of radar degradation plus barrel wear created cumulative accuracy reduction that threatened to make continued fire ineffective. Recovery procedure implemented by West Virginia's radar technicians involved bypassing failed cooling system component and accepting reduced cooling capability that would shorten magnetron tube life. But that restored transmitter power to approximately 90% of rated output. Technicians Chief Electronics Technician James Morrison and Electronics Technician First Class Robert Chen working in cramped radar equipment space while main battery firing created severe vibration completed bypass procedure in approximately 8 minutes, restoring radar effective range to approximately 38,000 yards, sufficient for engaging remaining Japanese forces, and this field repair demonstrated value of having skilled technicians who could improvise solutions under combat conditions rather than requiring equipment replacement or extensive troubleshooting that peacetime maintenance would allow. Decision by Captain Krylov approximately 0445 hours was to continue engagement despite equipment problems rather than breaking off to assess damage and perform comprehensive repairs. Krylov assessed that Japanese force, though severely damaged, retained sufficient capability to threaten American interests if allowed to escape. That temporary radar degradation didn't eliminate fire control capability completely, but merely reduced it to levels still superior to Japanese optical fire control in darkness conditions, and that continuing engagement accepting risk from equipment malfunctions was preferable to allowing Japanese survivors to withdraw, potentially requiring subsequent engagement under less favorable conditions. And this decision to accept risk and continue operations reflected aggressive command philosophy that prioritized mission accomplishment over equipment preservation. Combat effectiveness despite technical difficulties demonstrated resilience of radar fire control system. even with reduced transmitter power and degraded cooling. West Virginia continued achieving hit probabilities approaching 5% on targets at ranges exceeding 25,000 yards. Coordination with other battleships whose radar systems were functioning normally provided backup tracking, allowing West Virginia to receive targeting data from Tennessee when own radar performance was marginal, and fire control teams' experience gained during earlier phases of engagement allowed them to compensate partially for equipment limitations through estimation and extrapolation techniques that supplemented degraded radar data, and these factors meant that temporary equipment crisis reduced, but didn't eliminate West Virginia's combat capability, demonstrating that properly trained personnel could maintain effectiveness even when equipment performed below specifications. According to 7th Fleet Action Report summarizing Battle of Surigao Strait operations, final outcome achieved through radar-directed battleship fire represented complete tactical victory that validated radar fire control as revolutionary advancement in naval gunnery. Japanese Southern Force entered Surigao Strait with 7 warships, including 2 battleships intending to reach Leyte Gulf and disrupt American amphibious operations, and after 3-hour engagement 0300 to 0600 hours October 25. Southern Force had been effectively destroyed with battleships Yamashiro and Fuso sunk, heavy cruiser Mogami fatally damaged and sinking following day, and 3 destroyers sunk with only destroyer Shigeru escaping back through strait, and total Japanese casualties exceeded 2,000, representing approximately 90% of force strength, demonstrating that American battleship fire had achieved near-complete annihilation of enemy force. Total numbers regarding ammunition expenditure quantified engagement intensity. 6 American battleships collectively fired approximately 1,300 main battery shells weighing approximately 3,500 tons, representing approximately 35% of total ammunition loads carried, indicating sustained high-intensity fire. Cruisers fired approximately 4,200 6-inch and 8-inch shells, adding approximately 400 tons of projectiles, and destroyers that had attacked earlier in engagement fired approximately 47 torpedoes, contributing to cumulative damage, and collective American ordnance expenditure demonstrated that achieving decisive victory required sustained fire over extended period rather than brief overwhelming salvo that might have been anticipated. Rounds fired in targets eliminated through radar fire control coordination showed decisive effectiveness. American battleships achieved approximately 93 main battery hits from approximately 1,300 shells fired, representing 7% hit probability, comparable to daylight optical firing exercises, demonstrating that radar fire control had overcome visibility limitations that traditional night engagement would have imposed. Hits concentrated on Japanese capital ships, with Yamashiro suffering approximately 48 main battery hits before sinking, and Fuso approximately 32 hits, indicating that fire distribution among American battleships prevented overkill on single targets while ensuring all major threats were engaged. And accuracy metrics showed that experienced fire control teams like Hogan's aboard West Virginia achieved hit probabilities exceeding 15%, significantly above fleet average, suggesting that proficiency with radar fire control improved with practice. Accuracy comparison between radar-directed and historical optical-directed battleship fire showed radar's advantages. Battle of Jutland, May 1916. Largest previous battleship engagement had seen British and German battleships achieve approximately 3% hit probability at ranges averaging approximately 15,000 yards in daylight with good visibility, while Surigao Strait engagement achieved 7% hit probability at ranges averaging approximately 26,000 yards in complete darkness, demonstrating that radar fire control in worst visibility conditions matched or exceeded optical fire control in optimal conditions, representing approximately 100% improvement in effective engagement range and approximately twofold improvement in accuracy. Comparison to standard approach illustrated radar advantages. Traditional night battleship engagement doctrine called for closing to visual range approximately 8 to 10,000 yards before opening fire, accepting that closer range would expose American battleships to Japanese return fire. but calculating that optical fire control required visual target acquisition. But radar fire control allowed engaging at approximately 35 to 40,000 yards, providing approximately 20 to 25,000 yards standoff distance where Japanese couldn't return effective fire, creating one-sided engagement that traditional tactics couldn't achieve. And this tactical revolution meant that battleship with superior fire control could destroy enemy before enemy could return fire, representing fundamental change in surface warfare comparable to introduction of armor or steam propulsion in 19th century. Immediate tactical result was preservation of Leyte Gulf invasion force. Japanese Southern Forces mission was to reach Leyte Gulf and bombard American amphibious shipping and beachheads, creating casualties among approximately 160,000 American troops ashore and potentially forcing suspension or withdrawal of invasion. But complete destruction of Southern force in Surigao Strait prevented Japanese from reaching objectives, ensuring invasion continued uninterrupted and allowing American forces to consolidate positions ashore. And strategic significance extended beyond immediate tactical victory to include demonstration that American naval forces had achieved decisive technological and tactical superiority over Imperial Japanese Navy, making Japanese surface forces largely irrelevant for remainder of Pacific War. Broader Battle of Leyte Gulf context showed Surigao Strait as decisive component of largest naval battle in history. While Southern force was being destroyed in Surigao Strait, Center force was engaging escort carriers off Samar in separate action, and Northern force was being pursued by American fast carriers near Cape Engano, and collective operations October 23 to 26 involved approximately 282 ships and approximately 200,000 personnel from both sides, making Leyte Gulf largest naval battle ever fought, and Japanese Navy losses at Leyte Gulf totaled 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, representing approximately 30% of remaining Japanese naval strength, effectively eliminating Imperial Japanese Navy as strategic threat and securing American control of Philippine waters, enabling subsequent operations liberating Philippines and advancing toward Japan. Hogan's personal contribution, recognized through Navy Cross Award citation, specified that his exceptional proficiency in employing radar fire control under combat conditions contributed materially to achieving decisive victory at minimal cost, and that his technical expertise and tactical judgment validated revolutionary fire control methods that transformed naval surface warfare. And this recognition demonstrated that Navy leadership had acknowledged radar fire control's importance and had credited personnel who'd implemented systems successfully despite institutional skepticism that had characterized pre-war and early war attitudes toward electronic fire control. Casualty comparison between American and Japanese forces showed one-sided nature of radar-enabled victory. American casualties at Surigao Strait totaled approximately 40 killed and 60 wounded, primarily from Japanese torpedo attacks against destroyers during early engagement phases before battleship action began, with no battleship personnel casualties, while Japanese casualties exceeded 2,000 killed, including approximately 1,600 from Yamashiro and Fuso sinking, representing 90% Japanese casualty rate versus 3% American casualty rate, demonstrating that technological advantage had produced historically lopsided tactical outcome, and this disparity illustrated that radar fire control had fundamentally changed naval combat dynamics, creating situation where technologically superior force could achieve victory at minimal cost, reversing historical pattern where naval battles typically produced significant casualties for both sides. According to memorandum from Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz dated November 8, 1944. What senior commanders said after Surigao Strait reflected complete reversal of institutional skepticism about radar fire control. Nimitz wrote that Battle of Surigao Strait conclusively demonstrated that radar fire control represents revolutionary advancement in naval gunnery comparable to introduction of rifled guns or turret mounting, and that previous institutional resistance to radar fire control was misplaced, and that all battleship and cruiser forces shall receive intensive training. in radar-directed fire, emphasizing techniques that proved successful at Surigao, and this official acknowledgement from theater commander represented institutional validation of technology that many senior officers had dismissed before combat demonstrated its decisive effectiveness. Orders to train others based on Surigao Strait experience were issued November 1944. When Pacific Fleet established Advanced Fire Control School at Pearl Harbor, providing 6-week course for battleship and cruiser fire control officers, emphasizing radar-directed main battery fire, night engagement tactics, and coordination between multiple ships employing radar fire control, and curriculum incorporated specific lessons from Surigao, including procedures that Hogan had developed for maintaining tracking during radar degradation, techniques for coordinating fire between multiple radar-equipped ships, and methods for assessing battle damage using radar returns supplemented by spotter aircraft reports, and program-trained approximately 80 fire control officers during November 1944. March 1945. Preparing forces for anticipated final campaigns against Japan. How many units adopted radar fire control tactics quantified innovation's rapid dissemination, all Pacific Fleet battleships and cruisers by January 1945. Had received updated doctrine emphasizing radar fire control as primary method, with optical fire control relegated to backup role, reversing previous doctrine. Atlantic Fleet battleships supporting European operations received similar training, though opportunities for employing techniques were limited because German surface threat had been largely eliminated by Leyte 1944. And destroyer forces received training in radar-directed surface gunnery, though destroyer fire control radars were less sophisticated than battleship systems, limiting capability, but still providing advantages over optical methods in darkness or poor visibility, and this fleet-wide adoption demonstrated that successful combat validation could overcome years of institutional resistance when results were unambiguous. Recognition that radar fire control personnel received was mixed, with individual awards acknowledging specific contributions, but with broader institutional recognition focusing on validating technology rather than celebrating individuals. Hogan received Navy Cross as previously mentioned. Approximately 20 other fire control officers and radar technicians from Surigao Strait battleships received Bronze Stars or Navy Commendation Medals. But public recognition focused on Admiral Oldendorf commanding 7th Fleet battleships rather than on technical personnel who'd implemented radar systems, and this pattern reflected Navy's traditional emphasis on command responsibility rather than technical expertise, though post-battle analysis clearly identified that technological advantage rather than tactical brilliance had produced victory. Institutional documentation of procedures occurred December 1944. When Bureau of Ordnance published revised Naval Gunnery Manual incorporating radar fire control as primary method, manual specified that radar shall be employed as primary fire control means for all surface engagements regardless of visibility conditions, and that optical fire control shall be employed only when radar is unavailable or when tactical situation specifically requires optical methods. And this doctrinal reversal from pre-war emphasis on optical primacy demonstrated how completely Surigao Strait had changed institutional attitudes, and manual distributed fleet-wide established standardized procedures ensuring that lessons learned at Surigao would be implemented consistently across all naval forces. Statistical analysis of Pacific War battleship operations 1944 1945 showed Surigao Strait as unique engagement. But lessons had broader applicability. Surigao was last time battleships fought battleships, with no subsequent battleship versus battleship engagements occurring. But radar fire control proved valuable in shore bombardment missions where radar-directed fire against land targets achieved superior accuracy compared to optical methods, particularly during night operations, and battleships conducting shore bombardment at Iwo Jima February 1945. And Okinawa April-June. 1945. Employed radar fire control techniques developed at Surigao, achieving hit probabilities against land targets exceeding historical norms, demonstrating that innovation had applications beyond original tactical context. Successor officers who continued radar fire control innovation included multiple Surigao Strait veterans who received command assignments. Captain Herbert Krylov, commanding West Virginia at Surigao, promoted to Rear Admiral commanding Battleship Division. 1945. Several fire control officers, including Lieutenant Commander Thomas Sprague from Tennessee, received promotions to department head positions aboard carriers and cruisers, transferring radar expertise to other ship types, and Bureau of Ordnance incorporated Surigao veterans into post-war development programs for next-generation fire control systems, ensuring combat experience informed peacetime research, and this personnel continuity meant that lessons learned weren't lost after immediate post-battle period, but instead influenced naval development through Cold War era. Recovery period after Surigao for American battleships was minimal, with most ships resuming operations within days. West Virginia and Tennessee conducted shore bombardment supporting Leyte ground operations October 27 to November 5, demonstrating that Surigao engagement hadn't depleted ammunition stocks or caused battle damage requiring extended repairs. Remaining battleships similarly transitioned to shore bombardment and amphibious support missions, with Battle of Surigao Strait representing brief interruption and support operations rather than culminating event requiring stand-down period, and this operational tempo demonstrated American logistical capacity to sustain high-intensity operations while Japanese forces increasingly struggled with ammunition shortages and maintenance problems limiting their operational capability. Adoption timeline for radar fire control showed technology had been available, but doctrine had prevented optimal employment. Mark 8 radar had been installed on battleships beginning 1943, approximately 18 months before Surigao engagement. But institutional skepticism meant that training emphasized optical methods with radar treated as supplementary system, and only after combat success did doctrine shift to recognize radar as primary system, and this pattern illustrated how institutional conservatism could delay recognition of revolutionary capabilities even when technology had been deployed, suggesting that peacetime training and exercises often fail to identify optimal employment methods that combat conditions reveal. Budget allocation post-Surigao reflected commitment to radar development. Fiscal year 1946. Appropriations included substantial funding for next-generation fire control radar development, building on Surigao lessons. Post-war naval research programs emphasized electronic warfare and fire control automation, extending radar fire control concepts into missile guidance and automated combat systems that would characterize Cold War naval warfare. And long-term institutional commitment to electronic fire control validated that Surigao Strait had convinced Navy leadership that future naval warfare would emphasize sensors and electronics rather than traditional gunnery skills that had dominated for previous century. According to Naval Historical Center analysis and post-war assessments from multiple navies worldwide, radar fire control innovation that emerged victorious at Battle of Surigao Strait established foundation for all subsequent naval surface warfare by demonstrating that sensor technology could provide decisive advantages over traditional optical methods. Concept that electronic systems could acquire and track targets beyond visual range and could direct weapons accurately without optical observation became fundamental principle of modern naval warfare, influencing development of radar-guided missiles, automated combat systems, and network-centric warfare that characterizes contemporary naval operations. And Surigao Strait engagement specifically demonstrated that technological superiority could produce historically lopsided tactical outcomes where advanced force could destroy enemy at minimal cost, reversing traditional naval warfare pattern where major engagements typically produced significant casualties for both sides. Total lives saved through radar fire control deployment across Pacific War cannot be calculated precisely. But comparative analysis suggests substantial impact. Radar-directed surface gunnery allowed American forces to engage Japanese surface forces at standoff ranges, reducing American casualties from return fire. Shore bombardment using radar fire control achieved improved accuracy, reducing ammunition expenditure and mission duration, limiting exposure to Japanese counter-battery fire. And night operations enabled by radar fire control allowed continuous operations rather than ceasing at nightfall, effectively doubling operational tempo compared to forces limited to daylight operations. And if these advantages reduced casualties by even modest percentage across thousands of surface engagements, calculation suggests hundreds or thousands of American lives saved through technology that institutional skepticism had nearly prevented from being deployed. Battles where radar fire control capabilities proved critical beyond Surigao Strait included numerous shore bombardment operations supporting amphibious landings. Iwo Jima, February 1945, where battleships conducted three-day pre-invasion bombardment using radar fire control during night phases, maintaining continuous pressure on Japanese defenses. Okinawa, April-June 1945, where battleships provided 82 days of continuous fire support using radar-directed fire to engage targets that forward observers identified operating day and night without visibility limitations that previous operations had imposed, and dozens of smaller operations throughout Philippines' liberation and Western Pacific campaign where radar-equipped American ships consistently achieved tactical success against Japanese forces that lacked equivalent electronic capabilities, demonstrating that technological advantage established at Surigao persisted throughout war's final year. Modern military applications of principles developed during World War II radar fire control include Aegis combat system employed by contemporary destroyers and cruisers using phased array radar for simultaneous tracking of hundreds of targets, and automated fire control directing missiles against multiple threats, and fundamental concept that sensors can detect threats beyond visual range and that computers can calculate firing solutions faster and more accurately than human operators. Originated with World War II radar fire control systems like those employed at Surigao, though modern systems are orders of magnitude more capable than 1940s technology. International naval forces that adopted radar fire control during and after World War II include British Royal Navy, which employed radar fire control during Arctic convoy operations, achieving success against German surface raiders; Soviet Navy, which captured German radar fire control technology and incorporated it into post-war ship designs, influencing Cold War Soviet naval development; and Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, which studied Surigao Strait engagement extensively during post-war rebuilding, recognizing that technological deficiencies had contributed to Imperial Japanese Navy's defeat and emphasizing electronics and sensors in post-war force structure, and this international adoption demonstrated that radar fire control represented universal advancement applicable across different naval traditions and tactical doctrines. Technology evolution from World War II radar fire control to modern combat systems shows progressive sophistication while maintaining core principles. Mark 8 radar employed by American battleships at Surigao provided range and bearing to single target, updated approximately once per second, requiring human operators to maintain tracking and calculate firing solutions, while modern Spy 1 phased array radar employed by Aegis ships tracks hundreds of targets simultaneously with update rates exceeding 10 times per second, and integrated computers automatically calculate optimal engagement solutions. But fundamental concept of using electromagnetic sensors to detect targets and using electronic systems to direct weapons remains constant, demonstrating continuity between World War II innovation and contemporary capabilities. Hogan's fate and post-war career illustrated both recognition of expertise and Navy's traditional emphasis on command over technical specialization. He received promotion to commander 1945 and continued serving post-war in various fire control development roles at Bureau of Ordnance, received assignment as executive officer aboard cruiser USS Columbus. 1948. 1950. Gaining command experience beyond technical specialization, but never achieved flag rank, retiring. 1960. As captain after 26-year career, and he died. 1987. Age 75, having witnessed naval warfare's transformation from optical gunnery to guided missiles while maintaining throughout his life that Surigao Strait represented culmination of battleship era and beginning of electronic warfare age. Primary sources documenting Surigao Strait operations and radar fire control development include action reports from 6 American battleships held at National Archives containing detailed fire control logs and radar tracking data, Pacific Fleet Commander-in-Chief war diaries and operational summaries held at Naval History and Heritage Command documenting command assessments of engagement, Bureau of Ordnance technical reports on Mark 8 radar development and deployment held at Naval Research Laboratory archives providing engineering context, and Japanese Southern Force surviving personnel interviews conducted during post-war occupation providing Japanese perspective showing they were surprised by American ability to engage at extreme ranges in darkness, confirming that radar capability exceeded Japanese expectations. Strategic significance of Surigao Strait extended beyond immediate tactical victory to demonstrate technological transformation of naval warfare. Engagement proved that electronic sensors and fire control had made traditional gunnery skills less important than technical proficiency, with new systems suggesting that future naval warfare would emphasize technical education over traditional seamanship. Victory achieved at minimal cost demonstrated that technological superiority could reduce casualties, making advanced weapons development strategically valuable for casualty-averse democracies like United States, and complete destruction of Japanese force using methods that Japanese couldn't counter psychologically impacted Imperial Japanese Navy leadership, recognizing that American technological advantages were insurmountable, contributing to decision to employ desperate tactics like kamikaze attacks that characterized final year of Pacific War. Lessons from Battle of Surigao Strait relevant to modern military operations include recognition that institutional skepticism about new technology often underestimates revolutionary capabilities until combat validates systems, that peacetime training and exercises may not reveal optimal employment methods for new systems because peacetime conditions don't replicate combat stress and tactical complexity, that technological advantages can produce historically lopsided tactical outcomes when properly exploited, creating incentives for continuous innovation and development, and that personnel training must evolve alongside technology deployment, ensuring that operators can exploit system capabilities rather than applying traditional methods to new equipment, limiting effectiveness. Comparative analysis of naval warfare evolution shows Surigao Strait as inflection point. Previous naval battles from ancient era through early 20th century emphasized seamanship, gunnery, and tactical formations where commanders' decisions in cruise training determined outcomes and where technological advantages were incremental rather than revolutionary, while subsequent naval warfare increasingly emphasized sensors, electronics, and automated systems where technological superiority could produce decisive advantages independent of traditional naval skills, and Surigao Strait specifically marked transition where battleship era ended not through obsolescence of concept, but through demonstration that sensor-directed weapons had made traditional visual range gunnery obsolete, creating new paradigm for naval combat. The final assessment decades after Surigao Strait emphasizes that engagement represented validation of technological innovation over institutional conservatism, demonstrating that combat can reveal capabilities that peacetime analysis underestimates. That Battle of Surigao Strait specifically proved radar fire control was revolutionary advancement comparable to steam propulsion or armor plate rather than incremental improvement, as skeptics had argued. That technological superiority properly Exploited can achieve decisive tactical victories at minimal cost, reversing historical pattern where naval victories required accepting significant friendly casualties, and that lessons about relationship between technology, doctrine, and institutional resistance remain relevant for understanding how military organizations adopt innovations, suggesting that successful combat employment often requires overcoming internal skepticism before confronting external threats, and these insights about innovation adoption and institutional change extend beyond narrow technical domain of radar fire control to broader questions about how military organizations identify and implement revolutionary capabilities that peacetime culture may resist. But that combat necessity ultimately validates